I spend a lot of time on this channel discussing the tactics, histories, and misdeeds of pirates in the 17th century. One of my Patreon supporters asked me to provide a list of motivations as to why sailors turn to piracy. To some, the decision to go on the account requires no motivation, or it is utterly incomprehensible. Some view it as an adventurous lifestyle of freedom. Others find it ludicrous that you trap yourself in a wooden prison and risk every day dying from the noose or malnutrition. The truth is rarely so simple, and discussing this question can give us valuable insight into the lives of these men, who they were, and how they compare to similar groups throughout history. In the first part of the video, I intend to discuss the most common motivations. Next, we'll discuss the people who were unwillingly made into pirates. Lastly, we'll return to motivations, but discuss the less common ones. It is easy to imagine pirates through rose-tinted glasses as being freedom fighters that oppose a repressive regime such as the British Empire, or institutions like slavery and bad wages. Whilst I will discuss the validity of pirate ideology, the simple truth is that the biggest motivator was greed. Firstly, I'd like to discuss who the pirate is, because not every Jack or Joe had the guts to hoist the black flag. To become a pirate, you had to take risks. Heading off to sea was dangerous alone, and pirates had to additionally contend with being entirely alone in a hostile world where every armed authority is out for their heads. And for some, it was worth it. Most pirates were poor plebeians from England or France, with few opportunities to organically climb the social ladder. The controversial William Kidd was born into poverty in Scotland. Through privateering, he was able to become a wealthy denizen of New York, owning a large house, his private pew in the church, and a beautiful young wife. Others were already rich. They were men like Henry Jennings, a merchant and plantationer from Bermuda. He had more than enough money to survive and thrive, but still wanted more. What Jennings, Kidd, and most pirates had in common, whether prince or pauper, is that they always wanted more. Those pirates that did publish their written works wrote of this in their journals. Basil Ringrose, cartographer aboard the ship Trinity, wrote of our hungry appetite for gold and riches. His shipmate, John Cox, called this mammonic drive the sacred hunger for gold. Some pirates like to preach greater ideals and motivations, but more often than not, they were excuses. They could not admit that greed was their biggest drive, as had been the primary motivator for most people, doing whatever they do, since the Stone Age and before. And if it wasn't greed, it was because they liked it. The pirate lifestyle was unlike anything else. On a navy or merchant vessel, voyages were long. Punishments were frequent, food was bad, and the alcohol was rationed. Religious captains even forbade swearing. But on a pirate ship, you were largely free to do as you please, as long as it didn't hamper the crew's ability to effectively plunder ships at sea. Since pirates primarily operated on tropical isles, food was fresh and plentiful. Alcohol was drunk freely, and you could swear as much as you liked. Payment was issued fairly, and if you ever needed more food or clothes, you could just steal them from another ship. But freedom had other implications than rampant debauchery. Some privateers were scholars, such as the natural scientist William Dampier, or his colleague Lionel Wafer. They spent their free time not drinking or whoring, but recording foreign plants and cultures. Others enjoyed a fellowship, which can only blossom in the hardest of environments, where you and your lads feel besieged from all fronts by the world's authorities. You hoist the black flag in defiance of everyone, an enemy of mankind. To some, this was a welcome change from their previous lives. They could have been street rats in London. Maybe an Irish or Scotsman, deported from their homeland to serve as an indentured servant in the colonies. These were treated little better than slaves. Others had simply been bored. William Dampier wrote how his crew had sawyers, carpenters, joiners, brickmakers, bricklayers, shoemakers, tailors, etc. These men had decent, high-demand jobs. So why did they become pirates? Dampier doesn't say, but we can assume. On French ships, it was especially common to find young noblemen amongst the privateers and pirates. Some wished to enhance their fortunes, others had other plans. This lifestyle was reckless and addictive, and just like any addiction, you don't stick to it purely out of enjoyment. Walter Kennedy confessed in an interview that the pirate life was unhappy and wicked. They were always in dread and forced to flee or fight with every ship they met. When he was finally captured, he felt relieved. A large number of pirates did not choose their profession, but were forced into it. This widespread practice of press ganging serves as evidence that pirates were not the liberal freedom fighters which they are often imagined as. Press ganging is simply the act of forcing an individual into service. This practice was virtually never used by the buccaneers of the 1600s, who operated under a code of personal freedom and initiative-based discipline. Due to the culture and politics of their time, they had no trouble drawing recruits. The pirates of the early 18th century faced a more hostile climate and more legal repercussions, leaving them with less recruits. There were simply too few sailors willing to take the risks. It was especially hard finding educated specialists, surgeons, carpenters, navigators, and such. Even pirates who disliked press ganging, such as Benjamin Hornigold, had to resort to kidnapping these artisans if they wished to ensure the well-being of their ship and crew. In the late Golden Age, after the year 1718, pirates were especially dry on recruits, and resorted to press ganging ordinary seamen to drudge aboard their ships. Especially useful were the fishermen of Newfoundland, known for their hardiness. Press gang crewmen were referred to as forced men. Some of them grew accustomed to the pirate lifestyle, most famously Bartholomew Roberts. Others made it their prime goal to eventually escape. Pirates punished their attempts severely by flogging or marooning them, as a point to prevent others. If they didn't escape, they'd do everything to not appear complicit. A doctor kidnapped by Hornigold refused any payment, because this could be used against him in court. Forced men did everything to not sign the pirate articles, which would make them complicit in their crimes. If the forced men played their cards right, they could avoid punishment for the pirates, while simultaneously avoiding a death sentence at their inevitable trial. Most Europeans in the age of sail regarded black Africans as animals. They were a commodity which were to be used, abused, traded and sold. Pirates were a driving factor in the triangle trade. One of the first British slave traders was Francis Drake, a privateer. In the 17th century, buccaneers made a lot of money from capturing Spanish and Portuguese slave ships, and selling their human cargo in the burgeoning plantation industries on Barbados and Jamaica. Many black Africans found themselves aboard pirate ships, and would have been treated opportunistically. If the pirates were in desperate need for manpower, the slaves would have been inducted into the crew. Woodes Rogers did it to a group of Spanish slaves, and told them to see themselves as Englishmen. One document recommends that privateers recruit French-speaking slaves against their masters. Indeed, blacks could expect better treatment if they spoke a European language. Certainly, it was favorable to be a pirate and have at least some basic freedoms, but discrimination was always to be expected. If the pirates were less desperate, the slaves would have been just that. They would have been kept as a cheap labor force before being sold off. Naturally, the topic on pirates and slavery is much more complicated than what I could condense into these quick minutes. When discussing motivations, a black slave could not expect any life improvement from being captured by pirates. In many cases, the opposite. What most pirates of the Golden Age had in common was that they were Protestants that primarily plundered from Catholic Spain, and the religious undertones of this conflict must not be understated. This motivation was especially common in the 17th century, a time of extreme religious tension. Those 100 years saw the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, the Dragon Age, all conflicts pitting Christian sects against one another. A majority of buccaneers were Protestants. French Huguenots fled persecution back home and ended up seeking their freedom and revenge in the Caribbean. For the English, Puritans were greatly involved in the pirate life, in colonies such as New England and the Bahamas. They treated their fight against the Spanish like a holy war, and were known to execute priests and desecrate churches. Though many French filibusters were Huguenots, many more were Catholic. This did not stop their depredations. Though they refrained from destroying churches, they still stole the relics and gave them instead to their own, French churches. Indeed, national rivalries and intercultural hatred was likewise a typical motivation. François Laudonnière was a pirate that survived the Spanish massacre and would spend his career seeking bloodthirsty revenge. Even after the Franco-Spanish alliance in the early 18th century, their citizenry still hated one another. Pirate Captain Dulain, active in the 1720s, ordered that all captives be treated humanely, with an exception for the Spanish, who were butchered indiscriminately. The French and English maintained good relations throughout the 17th century, and their pirates frequently teamed up against the Spanish or Dutch. It was only after the War of Spanish Succession that the two countries began their legendary rivalry. When the war ended, patriotic pirates would continue their own private wars of plunder, but exclusively against the French and Spanish. The Spanish responded to these depredations with their own, fighting fire with fire, only stoking the flames. Their coast guard would capture ships on the flimsiest of charges, torturing the innocent crewmen and behaving little better than pirates themselves. The English responded with piracy, and the cycle of violence continued. Many pirates claimed to be vigilantes against Spanish injustice, but these were convenient excuses to make a profit from misery. Pirates are usually compared to criminal groups, but I find the Golden Age rogues, the pirates and buccaneers and privateers, more comparable to paramilitary organizations. In their heyday, they were not entirely regarded as criminals, but operated in a legal and cultural grey zone. They worked in a similar manner to paramilitary groups, and had similar motivations. On the face of it, they fought for their country or religion. The true motivator was greed, or the thrill of violence. The idea of pirates rebelling against their overlords is a trope not only popular amongst writers of fiction, but likewise some historians. It is true that many sailors faced repression and harsh conditions under cruel captains. There are accounts of whipping, torture, and even murder. But in these cases, the captains were subject to the law and typically hanged. As I previously explained, such practices were utilized by pirates, and I've never heard of a pirate captain being deposed for being too cruel on his captives. In pirate society, violence was accepted. The idea of cruel captains seemed to be overblown. Surely the Royal Navy did press gang, but it was rare that they kidnapped anyone but experienced sailors. If you'd never been aboard a ship, they'd leave you well alone. You just weren't worth it. Wages aboard a merchant ship were decent, with sailors earning the same as a tailor or weaver, despite not needing any education. Injured seamen in navy or merchant service were pensioned by a welfare system, and though pirates emulated these institutions themselves, it was nothing exclusive. The crew of Samuel Bellamy referred to themselves as Robin Hood's men. They stole from the rich and gave to themselves. In their minds, they were the merry men of Sherwood, who lived freely on their own terms. If a pirate rebelled against the system, it was rebelling against boredom, in the favor of a more thrilling lifestyle. Most pirates in the 18th century appeared to have Jacobite sympathies. The Jacobites were a political movement that wished to restore the House of Stuart as the ruling dynasty of Britain. The Stuarts had supported the privateers, giving them commissions during wartime and generous pardons during peace. Pirates were observed name their ships after the Stuarts, drinking to their name, and hoisting flags associated with them. So in short, the pirate revolution of our imagination wasn't a liberal freedom fighter, but a reactionary. A Tory, a monarchist, a conservative. They weren't proto-communists or leftists. In 1918 they would have joined the German Freikorps. In 2021 they would have stormed the US Capitol. I've seen the Golden Age pirates compared to modern biker gangs, and I find the comparison rather apt. Whilst these gangs do often have political sympathies, they rarely have any qualms going against their ideals to make a buck. Politics wasn't the pirates' primary motivation, it was money. Plenty of pirates with Jacobite sympathies had no qualms with accepting pardons and rejoining the new order. These included Henry Jennings, and likely would have included Edward Teach. Blackbeard is known for having declined the king's pardon, similar to dire Jacobites like Charles Vane. Simultaneously, Blackbeard refused to work together with Vane, in the latter's ambition to start a Jacobite revolt in the Caribbean. Genealogist Bayless Brooks speculate that Blackbeard's ambition was to wait for the inevitable war between England and Spain. Thus, he could get a commission and become a legal privateer again. Until then, he was free to pirate as he pleased. If you wish to learn more about this theory, I suggest you take a look at my video about Blackbeard's attack on Charleston. The point is that despite Blackbeard's own political leanings, he wouldn't mind a pardon if it meant he'd make more money. Huge thanks to my generous supporters over on Patreon. Special thanks to my shareholder tier supporters: Cole Freer, Max Twick, Mikhail Jans, 1660, Sea Dog, and Daniel Stryker. If you want to support me monetarily, please check out the links to PayPal or Patreon in the video description. If you want to otherwise support the channel, hit the subscribe and notification button. Share the video with a friend, like the video, and tell me in the comments what you liked or disliked about this one, and what you want to see next. Cheers!